When Muriel Windrider opened her cottage door to find a stranger bleeding into her lavender patch. She had no idea she was staring into the eyes of the ghost who'd carried her father's dying words across a battlefield 5 years prior. The storm had been battering the highlands for 3 days when the knock came, soft, hesitant, barely audible above the wind's howling. Muriel set down her mending and listened. Nothing. Then it came again, weaker this time, like autumn leaves tapping against glass. She shouldn't answer. Any sensible woman living alone on the moor knew better than to open her door to strangers, especially with tales of deserters and bandits roaming the countryside since the war's end. But something in that knock, its very frailty, tugged at her conscience. The man who collapsed against her doorframe looked more corpse than soldier. His clothes hung in tatters, stained with mud, and what she prayed was not all blood. Dark hair plastered to his skull framed a face carved hollow by hunger and exhaustion. When he lifted his eyes to hers, she saw something that made her step back, not fear, but recognition so profound it stole her breath. "Please," he whispered, and his voice carried the rasp of a man who'd screamed himself hoarse. "Just shelter from the storm." Muriel's hand tightened on the door. Her father's voice echoed from memory. "Kindness costs nothing, daughter, but cruelty costs everything." Captain Aldrich Windrider had died believing in honor, in helping those who couldn't help themselves. She'd buried him 5 years ago with his medals and his principles. "You're hurt," she said, noting how he favored his left side. "I'll not trouble you long." He swayed, catching himself against the doorframe. "Dawn comes, I'll be gone." The wind chose that moment to unleash its fury, driving rain like bullets against the cottage walls. Muriel made her choice. She stepped aside. "Come in, then, before we both catch our deaths." He stumbled past her, leaving muddy prints on her clean floor. She didn't care. The stranger's shoulders shook, whether from cold or pain, she couldn't tell. Up close, she could see the careful way he moved, protecting that injured side, and the way his eyes cataloged every exit even as exhaustion threatened to topple him. "Sit." She gestured toward the chair by her fireplace. "I'll fetch dry clothes. I don't want charity. Then call it Christian duty." She was already moving toward her father's old trunk, the one she'd never quite found the courage to empty. "My father always kept spare garments for travelers." Something flickered across the stranger's face at the mention of her father, but fatigue clouded his features before she could interpret it. She pulled out a shirt and trousers that would hang loose on his frame. Her father had been a larger man, and set them on the table. "There's broth warming on the stove. Help yourself while I tend your wounds." "Miss, I can't." "You can and you will." She met his gaze steadily. "Unless you'd prefer to bleed to death in my favorite chair. The cushions are newly sewn." That earned her what might have been a smile, though it vanished so quickly she couldn't be sure. She busied herself gathering clean cloth and her medicine box while he changed, careful to keep her back turned though propriety seemed foolish given the circumstances. When she faced him again, her breath caught. Without the mud and rags, she could see him properly, the noble line of his jaw despite its hollowed cheeks, the military bearing that exhaustion couldn't quite erase. And those eyes, why did they seem so familiar? "Your side," she said, noting how he held himself. "Old injury. Nothing serious. Let me decide that." She dipped cloth in warm water and approached. "I've some skill with healing." He tensed as she drew near, every muscle coiled like a trapped animal's. But when her fingers found the tear in the borrowed shirt, he didn't pull away. The wound beneath was infected, angry red lines spreading from what looked like a bayonet scar. "Old, you said." She began cleaning it with gentle efficiency. "This is fresh. 3 days, perhaps 4. His jaw tightened. "Bandits. They thought I carried coin." "Did you?" "Not enough to die for." She worked in silence, aware of his breathing, the way he studied her face while she tended him. When she reached for her father's whiskey to clean the wound, he caught her wrist. "You needn't waste good spirits on me. It's medicine now." But his touch sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. His hands were scarred, she noticed, old wounds that spoke of battles fought and survived. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "Kalen." "Kalen." She tested the name, finding it fit him somehow. Strong but weathered, like the Highland stones. "I'm Muriel." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps even pain. His grip on her wrist loosened, and she thought she heard him whisper something that sounded like God's mercy. The whiskey hissed against his wound, and he went rigid, but didn't cry out. Stubborn pride, she thought. The same pride that had gotten her father killed, refusing to retreat when retreat meant survival. There. She bound the wound with strips of clean linen. That should hold, but you need rest. Real rest, not whatever you've been managing on the road. I told you, come morning, morning's still hours away. She stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they'd been, how his scent of leather and rain had filled her senses. The storm won't break before then. You'll take my father's bed. Tonight. And you? I'll manage by the fire. I've done it before. He started to protest, but she silenced him with a look that brooked no argument. Outside, thunder rolled across the moor like artillery fire, and she saw him flinch at the sound. Whatever battles this man had fought, they hadn't left him unmarked. She banked the fire and settled into her chair with a quilt. She watched him disappear into her father's room. Only then did she allow herself to wonder why Kalen's eyes had seemed so familiar, why his voice stirred memories she couldn't quite grasp. But in the pre-dawn darkness, as the stranger's fevered dreams began to spill secrets into the quiet cottage, Muriel would discover that some debts transcend death itself. The fever took him near midnight. Muriel woke to the sound of anguish. Not screaming, but something worse. Low, broken words that seemed torn from a man's very soul. She threw off her quilt and hurried to her father's room, where moonlight revealed Kalen thrashing against sheets soaked with sweat. No, left him, should have stayed. His voice cracked with desperation. Captain, Captain, can you hear me? Muriel's blood chilled. She'd heard those same tortured whispers 5 years ago, when survivors from her father's regiment had stumbled home with tales of the Battle of Thornridge. How many men had died calling for their officers? How many had carried the weight of comrades lost? She approached the bed carefully. His skin burned with fever, and the wound she'd dressed showed fresh bleeding through the bandages. Infection was claiming him, just as it had claimed so many soldiers who'd survived the battlefield, only to die from festering wounds. Kalen. She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. You're safe. The battle's over. His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. For a moment, she thought he might strike her, but then his gaze found her face and something shifted. The wildness faded, replaced by confusion and a grief so raw it made her chest ache. Muriel. His voice was barely a whisper. You look just like who? She kept her tone gentle, the way she'd learned to speak to frightened animals. But the fever had him again. His head turned restlessly on the pillow, and she heard him mutter names. Aldrich, Thompson, McGillery. Her father's name among them sent ice through her veins. Tell me about Captain Aldrich, she said softly, testing Kalen's hand shot out, grasping her wrist with surprising strength. Good man. Best officer I ever served under. Should have. God help me. I should have been faster. Faster how? The charge came from nowhere. Rebels, screaming like demons. Captain tried to rally the men, but his grip tightened until it hurt. Shrapnel took him down. Still breathing when I reached him. Still giving orders. Muriel's world tilted. She'd been told her father died instantly, that he felt no pain. The military chaplain had assured her it was quick, merciful. But this man spoke of shrapnel, of her father conscious and wounded on a battlefield. What did he say? The words escaped before she could stop them. That Kalen's fevered gaze fixed on her with startling clarity. He said to tell his daughter that honor matters more than survival, but love matters more than honor. The exact words were carved into her father's headstone. Muriel pulled back as if burned. Who are you? But consciousness was slipping from him again. His hand fell away, and he descended back into fevered muttering. She sat frozen beside the bed, mind reeling. Only she and the military chaplain knew those final words. The letter had been private, meant for her alone. Unless she thought of the handful of survivors who'd made it home from Thornridge. Broken men who'd spoken of heroism and horror in equal measure. Could Kalen have been among them? Had he carried her father's final message across a battlefield thick with smoke and screaming? The storm outside seemed to echo her turmoil. Rain lashed the windows like accusatory fingers, and she found herself studying the stranger's face by lamplight. Without fever and exhaustion, what would he look like? Had she seen him before, perhaps among the soldiers who'd come to pay their respects after the funeral? She spent the night tending him, changing bandages and forcing water between his lips when the fever spiked. By dawn, his breathing had eased, though sweat still beaded his forehead. "You're safe. The battle's over." His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. For a moment, she thought he might strike her, but then his gaze found her face and something shifted. The wildness faded, replaced by confusion and a grief so raw it made her chest ache. "Meryl." His voice was barely a whisper. You look just like who?" She kept her tone gentle, the way she'd learned to speak to frightened animals. But the fever had him again. His head turned restlessly on the pillow, and she heard him mutter names. Aldrich, Thompson, McGillery. Her father's name among them sent ice through her veins. "Tell me about Captain Aldrich," she said softly, testing Kalen's hand shot out, grasping her wrist with surprising strength. "Good man. Best officer I ever served under. Should have. God help me. I should have been faster." "Faster how?" The charge came from nowhere. Rebels, screaming like demons. Captain tried to rally the men, but his grip tightened until it hurt. Shrapnel took him down, still breathing when I reached him, still giving orders. Muriel's world tilted. She'd been told her father died instantly, that he felt no pain. The military chaplain had assured her it was quick, merciful. But this man spoke of shrapnel, of her father conscious and wounded on a battlefield. What did he say? The words escaped before she could stop them. That Kalen's fevered gaze fixed on her with startling clarity. He said to tell his daughter that honor matters more than survival, but love matters more than honor. The exact words were carved into her father's headstone. Muriel pulled back as if burned. "Who are you?" But consciousness was slipping from him again. His hand fell away, and he descended back into fevered muttering. She sat frozen beside the bed, mind reeling. Only she and the military chaplain knew those final words. The letter had been private, meant for her alone. Unless she thought of the handful of survivors who'd made it home from Thornridge. Broken men who'd spoken of heroism and horror in equal measure. Could Kalen have been among them? Had he carried her father's final message across a battlefield thick with smoke and screaming? The storm outside seemed to echo her turmoil. Rain lashed the windows like accusatory fingers, and she found herself studying the stranger's face by lamplight. Without fever and exhaustion, what would he look like? Had she seen him before, perhaps among the soldiers who'd come to pay their respects after the funeral? She spent the night tending him, changing bandages and forcing water between his lips when the fever spiked. By dawn, his breathing had eased, though sweat still beaded his forehead. The worst had passed. When he finally woke, full consciousness returning with the morning light, she was sitting in the chair beside his bed, her father's military commendation in her hands. "You knew him?" It wasn't a question. Kalen struggled to sit up, his face pale but alert. "Miss Windrider, you were there. At Thornridge." She held up the medal. "You carried his last words." He closed his eyes, and she saw the weight of memory settle over him like a physical burden. "I tried to save him. We all did. But the rebels kept coming, and he was hurt too badly to move. By the time we drove them back, tell me." Her voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Tell me how my father really died." Kalen was quiet for so long she thought he might refuse. Then, slowly, he began to speak. It was September. Morning mist still clung to the valley when the attack came. Your father was inspecting the forward positions. He always did that, made sure the men knew he shared their dangers. That's when the first cannon opened up. His voice grew distant, as if he were seeing it all again. Shrapnel from the third volley caught him across the chest and shoulder. Should have killed him outright, but Captain Aldrich was stubborn as Highland granite. He kept giving orders, trying to organize a retreat that would save as many men as possible. "You stayed with him. I was his sergeant. Your duty was to survive." The words came out sharper than she intended. "Why didn't you leave him?" Kalen met her eyes directly. "Because he asked me to stay. Not as an order, as a request. He said he had something important to tell his daughter, and he needed someone to remember it exactly." Muriel's throat tightened. The words about honor and love. He made me repeat them back 3 times. Even with rebel bullets flying overhead, even with blood on his lips, he made sure I had them perfect. Kalen's voice cracked slightly. Then he pressed something into my hand. Said to make sure you got it when the time was right. What was it? Instead of answering, Kalen struggled to reach the tattered coat he'd worn the night before. From an inner pocket, he withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. With trembling fingers, he unwrapped a small silver locket. One Muriel recognized instantly. Mother's locket, she breathed. He wore it always. I thought it was lost. He said it belonged with you. Said you'd understand what it meant. Kalen held it out to her. I've carried it for 5 years, waiting for the courage to find you. Waiting for the right words to explain why I survived when better men didn't. She took the locket with hands that shook. Inside would be the miniature portrait of her mother, painted during their courtship. Her father had treasured it, claimed. It brought him luck in battle. Why now, she asked. Why come here after all this time? Kalen's laugh held no humor. Because I finally understood what he meant. About love mattering more than honor. I've spent 5 years trying to live up to his example, trying to be worthy of the message he entrusted to me. But honor without purpose is just pride wearing a uniform. And what changed? I met a woman. In the lowlands. She reminded me that life is for the living, not for ghosts. His expression grew pained. But when I tried to court her, tried to build something real, the nightmares came back. The guilt. How could I claim happiness when men like your father gave their lives for duty? Muriel felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite sympathy, but understanding. So you ran. I ran. Told myself I was searching for something. But really I was just running from the life I didn't deserve. He gestured weakly around the room. Until the storm brought me here, to the one place I never had the courage to visit. You think this is coincidence? I think your father was a man who believed in divine providence. Maybe he's still looking out for his men. The locket felt warm in her palm, heavy with memory and meaning. She thought of her father's words about kindness, about helping those who couldn't help themselves. Had he somehow orchestrated this meeting across the veil of death itself? You're wrong about one thing, she said finally. Kalen waited. You do deserve happiness. Father would never have entrusted his final words to a man unworthy of them. She met his eyes steadily. The question is, what are you going to do with the life he helped save? Before he could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning air. Multiple horses, riding hard across the moor. Muriel rose and moved to the window, her blood turning to ice at what she saw. 6 men in military uniform, but not the clean blue of the Queen's army. These were the patched gray of the border guard, the rough men who hunted deserters and collected bounties on those who'd fled their service, and they were riding straight for her cottage, with wanted posters clutched in their hands and iron. Determination written across their weathered faces. Get up. Muriel's voice cut through the morning stillness like a blade. Now. Kalen struggled to his feet, favoring his wounded side. Through the window, the border guard had slowed their approach, spreading out in a semicircle that spoke of military precision. These weren't local constables, they were manhunters. Back door? He asked, already reaching for his boots. They'll have it covered. Muriel's mind raced. 6 men, all armed, all experienced in tracking fugitives across hostile terrain. The root cellar, behind the kitchen. I won't hide while you'll do as I say. She thrust her father's spare pistol into his hands. Unless you'd prefer to hang today. The lead rider was close enough now that she could see his face, weathered as old leather, with the cold eyes of a man who measured worth in coin. Captain Drystan Nightmore of the Border Guard, if the insignia on his coat spoke true. She'd heard stories about him in the village. A man who collected deserters like other men collected hunting trophies. Miss Windrider. His voice carried across the yard as he dismounted. Might we have a word? Muriel stepped onto her threshold, careful to keep her expression neutral. Captain, what brings the border guard to my door? Nightmore's pale eyes swept the cottage, noting details. The muddy boot prints Kalen had left. The extra plate beside her wash basin. The careful way she positioned herself in the doorway. We're tracking a deserter. Dangerous man. Goes by several names. But we believe his true identity is Sergeant Kalen Viral, late of the 42nd Highland Regiment. He unfolded a wanted poster, a rough sketch that captured enough of Kalen's features to be damning. 500 pounds. Sterling for his capture. Dead or alive. The sum made her stomach clench. More money than most Highland families saw in a decade. What's his crime? Murder. killed a fellow soldier over a gambling debt, then fled his post. Nightmore's smile was winter cold. The Crown takes a dim view of men who abandon their duty. Lies. Every word was lies. Muriel could see it in the way his sergeant avoided her eyes, in the too practiced delivery of his speech. But challenging him directly would only raise suspicions. I've seen no strangers here, Captain. Only the storm. Curious thing about storms, Miss Windrider. They have a way of driving all manner of creatures to shelter. He gestured to his men, who began a slow circle around the cottage. Mind if we look around? For your own safety, of course. It wasn't really a question. Border guards operated under martial authority. They could search what they pleased, take what they wanted. Muriel stepped aside with apparent reluctance. Of course. Though I warn you, the place is a mess. I wasn't expecting visitors. Nightmore entered first, his gaze cataloging everything. The damp clothes still hanging near the fire. The bloodstained cloth she'd used to clean Kalen's wound. The chair where she'd spent the night, still bearing the impression of her body. You sleep poorly, Miss Windrider. The storm kept me wakeful. She watched him examine the bloody cloth. With professional interest. I cut myself mending yesterday. Clumsy with the needle. He pocketed the cloth anyway. And this? He gestured to the extra plate. I always set 2 places. Habit from when father was alive. Behind them, she heard his men searching the other rooms. Heavy boots on creaking floors, the sound of furniture being moved. One of them would find the root cellar eventually. It was only a matter of time. Your father, Nightmore continued conversationally. Captain Aldrich Windrider, wasn't it? Died at Thornridge. Yes. Heroic action, from what I heard. Saved half his men with a fighting retreat. His eyes never left her face. Shame about the sergeant who abandoned him. The words hit like a physical blow. I beg your pardon. Military records show his sergeant fled the field before the retreat was complete. Left the captain to die alone. Nightmore's smile was cruel now. Same sergeant we're hunting today? Interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say? Muriel's world tilted. Everything Kalen had told her, the staying behind, the final words, the locket, had it all been lies. A deserter's guilt transformed into heroic fiction. Captain, one of the soldiers called from the kitchen. Found something. Nightmore's expression sharpened. He moved toward the voice, and Muriel followed on unsteady legs. The soldier stood beside the open root cellar, holding up a strip of cloth stained with fresh blood. Bandaged, sir. Still damp. Well. Nightmore turned back to Muriel with predatory satisfaction. It seems your clumsiness with needles is more serious than you claimed. Before she could respond, another shout echoed from outside. Through the window, she saw 2 of the guards dragging a struggling figure from behind the woodshed. Not Kalen. Her heart leaped, but Ezrin Cloudmere, the simpleton who lived rough on the moors and sometimes begged food from her kitchen. Found this one hiding, Captain, the soldier called. Matches the description well enough. Ezrin was near. Kalen's height and build, though his mind had never quite recovered from a childhood fever. He often sheltered in her outbuildings during storms, and the poor soul looked terrified by the armed men surrounding him. Please, Ezrin stammered. I only wanted somewhere dry. The lady, she's kind to me sometimes. Nightmore studied the frightened man with calculating eyes. Close enough to the description to satisfy a bureaucrat. Simple enough not to contradict whatever story they chose to tell. This him? He asked his sergeant. The younger man looked uncertain. Could be, sir. Hard to tell with the beard and all. Please. Muriel stepped forward. Ezrin's harmless. He's lived on these moors all his life. Ask anyone in the village. The village is 8 miles away, Miss Windrider. Who's to say this man hasn't been using that reputation as cover? Nightmore's tone was reasonable, which made it more terrifying. Deserters are cunning. They often pose as harmless wanderers. She watched in horror as they bound Ezrin's hands. The poor man didn't understand what was happening, only that rough soldiers were hurting him, and she, the one person who'd shown him kindness, wasn't stopping them. You're making a mistake, she said desperately. Am I? Nightmore's cold gaze fixed on her. 500 pounds says otherwise. And if we're wrong? He shrugged. Well, 1 fewer vagrant cluttering the Queen's highways. They were going to take him. Take an innocent man to hang for crimes he couldn't even comprehend, all because it was easier than admitting they'd lost their real quarry. The injustice of it burned in her throat like acid. Wait. The word escaped before she could stop it. Nightmare paused in the doorway. Yes. Her mind raced. What could she offer? What did she have that might buy Ezran's life? Then her gaze fell on her father's medal collection, displayed in the place of honor above the mantel. You said the deserter was from the 42nd Highland Regiment. That's right. My father commanded that regiment. I have his personal effects, his correspondence with the War Office. If this man truly abandoned his post, there would be records. Official documentation. Nightmore's interest sharpened. Go on. Let me check father's papers. If I can prove this poor soul isn't your deserter, will you release him? And if you can't, then you take them both. The words tasted like ashes. But if I'm right, you leave empty-handed and never trouble me again. It was a gamble that could cost everything. If Nightmare called her bluff and searched more thoroughly, he'd find Kaelin hiding in the root cellar. But if she could buy time, create enough doubt, Nightmare considered for a long moment. Then he smiled, the expression of a cat playing with wounded prey. Very well, Miss Windrider. You have 1 hour. Find me proof this man isn't Kaelin Viral, or I take both him and whatever other secrets you're hiding. His gaze swept the cottage. Once more, and Miss Windrider, I should mention that harboring a deserter carries the same penalty as desertion itself. As the border guard settled in to wait, Muriel realized she'd just wagered her life on a stack of her father's old papers, and the desperate hope that somewhere in those yellowed documents lay the truth that could save them all. The papers were kept in her father's military chest, locked away with his dress uniform and campaign medals. Muriel's hands trembled as she worked the key, acutely aware of Nightmare's cold gaze boring into her back. Through the window, she could see his men guarding poor Ezran, who sat bound and confused in her garden. Having trouble, Miss Windrider. Nightmare's voice carried mock concern. The lock sticks in damp weather. She forced steadiness into her tone while her mind screamed. What was she looking for? What proof could possibly exist in 5-year-old documents? The chest opened with a protesting creak. Inside lay the carefully preserved remnants of her father's service, letters from the War Office, commendations, duty rosters, and beneath it all, his personal journal bound in cracked leather. She'd never read it. The private thoughts of the dead had seemed too sacred to disturb. But now, with lives hanging in the balance, she lifted it with reverent hands. What's that? Nightmare stepped closer. Father's journal. He kept detailed records of his men, their conduct, their service. Her fingers found the entries from September 5 years past, the weeks leading up to Thornridge. If Sergeant Viral truly deserted, father would have noted it. She opened to the relevant pages, scanning her father's careful script. Daily entries about weather, supplies, morale. Names of men commended or disciplined. And there, September 12th, 3 days before the battle, Sergeant K. Viral continues to show exceptional dedication. Volunteered again today to carry dispatches through rebel territory. The men trust him implicitly, no small feat given the rumors of Confederate infiltrators in our ranks. If all my sergeants showed half his courage, Muriel's breath caught. September 15th, the day of Thornridge, dawn approaches. Intelligence suggests rebel movement to our east. I've positioned Sergeant Viral with the rear guard, though he protested the assignment. Claims his place is at the front with his men. Reminded him that the rear guard may prove our salvation if the day goes poorly. A good soldier follows orders, but a great one understands their purpose. Her hands shook as she turned the page. The entry broke off mid-sentence, ink spattering where her father's hand had faltered. But in the margin, written in a different hand, shakier, desperate, were final words. K stayed. Good man. Tell him, honor matters more than survival, but love matters more than honor. AW, the same message Kaelin had carried, written in her father's dying hand. Well, Nightmare's patience was wearing thin. Muriel looked up to find him studying her, face with predatory intensity. Behind him, she glimpsed movement, the slightest shift of shadow near the kitchen doorway. Kaelin, listening from the root cellar's entrance, close enough to hear but not be seen. The journal confirms Sergeant Viral's presence at Thornridge, she said carefully, but not his actions during the battle. Convenient. Nightmare's smile was razor thin. Military records can be edited, especially by grieving families who prefer heroic fiction to ugly truth. Are you suggesting I've falsified my father's journal? I'm suggesting that 500 pounds buys a great deal of creative interpretation. He gestured toward Ezrin, still bound in the garden. Unless you can produce something more substantial than fond family memories, I'll be taking my prisoner. Mural's desperation sharpened. The journal proved Kaelin hadn't deserted before the battle, but it couldn't speak to what happened during the fighting. She needed something else, some piece of evidence that would. Her gaze fell on a loose paper tucked between the journal's pages. An official dispatch, stamped with the War Office seal and dated 3 days after Thornridge. She unfolded it with careful hands. By order of General Harrison Blackmore, the following commendations are hereby awarded to survivors of the action at Thornridge Village. Sergeant Kaelin Viral, 42nd Highland Regiment. Medal for Valor, in recognition of heroic action. In carrying wounded from the field under enemy fire. Specifically noted for refusing evacuation despite personal injury. Remaining with Captain Aldrich Windrider until relief arrived. Recommended for promotion to lieutenant. The room spun around her. Kaelin hadn't deserted. He'd been recommended for promotion. The War Office itself testified to his heroism. Captain Nightmore, she said, her voice stronger now. Perhaps you'd care to explain how a deserter receives the Medal for Valor? She held out the dispatch. Nightmore's expression darkened as he read, his jaw working like a man chewing something bitter. Forgeries are easily purchased, he said finally, but doubt had crept into his voice. From the War Office? With General Blackmore's personal seal? Mural pressed her advantage. That would be treason, Captain. Are you accusing me of treasonous forgery? The accusation hung in the air between them. Even border guards couldn't level such charges lightly. Not against the daughter of a decorated officer, not without ironclad proof that Nightmore's pale eyes glittered with frustrated rage. Perhaps the records were confused. Battle reports often contain errors. 3. Separate documents, all confirming Sergeant Viral's heroism. That's quite a collection of convenient errors. Mural folded the dispatch carefully. I believe you owe Ezrin Cloudmere an apology, Captain, and my cottage an untroubled departure. For a moment, she thought he might refuse. His hand rested on his sword hilt, and she could see him calculating odds. 6 armed men against 1 woman and a simpleton. Who would question their version of events? Then his sergeant spoke up, voice carefully neutral. Captain, if the War Office records are authentic, I know what they mean, Sergeant. Nightmore's tone could have frozen August. But he stepped back, recognizing the trap she'd laid. Challenge the documents and risk charges of impeding military justice. Accept them and lose both his quarry and his reputation. Very well, Miss Windrider. It appears our information was incomplete. His smile promised future retribution. We'll release the vagrant and continue our search elsewhere. How generous of you. But as Nightmore turned toward the door, the creak of floorboards betrayed movement in the kitchen. His head snapped up, predatory instincts sharpening. What was that? Old house, Mural said quickly. The timbers settle in damp weather. He moved toward the kitchen with deliberate steps. Perhaps I should inspect your root cellar one more time. For settling timbers. Panic clawed at her throat. If he found Kaelin now, after she'd just proved his innocence, it would raise questions she couldn't answer. Why was a decorated war hero hiding in her cellar? What was their connection? Captain. The voice came from the kitchen doorway, steady, resigned, carrying the weight of inevitable fate. Kaelin stepped into view, still pale from fever, but standing straight. He dressed in her father's uniform, somehow finding the strength to don the blue coat and brass buttons with military precision. In the morning light, cleaned and properly clothed, he looked every inch the sergeant he'd once been. Sergeant Viral, I presume. Nightmore's triumph was immediate and vicious. Kaelin's gaze found Mural's, and she saw apology there, along with something deeper. I surrender myself to your custody, Captain, but I demand you honor the lady's wager. She proved I'm no deserter. Ezrin Cloudmere goes free. How noble. Nightmore's laugh was winter cruel. But you see, Sergeant, the charges have evolved. We're no longer interested in desertion. What charges? Murder, theft, sedition. Each word fell like a hammer blow. Amazing how crimes multiply when a man becomes inconvenient. Mural watched in horror as the trap revealed itself. They'd never cared about desertion. That was just the excuse to get close. But what did they really want? Why hunt a decorated war hero with such determination? You're after something else, she said, pieces clicking together. This isn't about military justice at all. Nightmore's cold smile confirmed her suspicion. Clever girl. Yes, Sergeant Viral has something that belongs to my employer. Something he took from a battlefield that wasn't his to claim. I've taken nothing but scars and nightmares, Kalen said. Haven't you? Nightmore's hand moved to his coat, withdrawing a familiar object that made Muriel's blood freeze. Another locket. Silver, identical to the one her father had given Kalen, except this one bore different initials. Not her mother's graceful script, but harsh, angular letters. RB. Recognize this, Sergeant? You should. You pulled it from around Colonel Rebecca Blackthorn's neck before you put a knife between her ribs. The accusation hit like lightning. Muriel stared at Kalen, searching his face for denial, for outrage, for anything that would refute the charge. Instead, she saw only weary acceptance. She was a traitor, he said quietly, selling intelligence to the Confederates. Good soldiers died because of her betrayal. She was also my employer's daughter. Nightmore's voice carried deadly satisfaction, and he wants both his daughter's killer and her locket returned, dead or alive. As the morning sun climbed higher, Muriel realized she stood between two truths: the man who'd honored her father's dying wish, and the killer who'd taken justice into his own hands with a blade in the dark. The silence stretched like a bowstring, ready to snap. Muriel's gaze moved between Kalen's resigned face and Nightmore's predatory smile, her mind racing through impossible choices. A war hero who'd killed in the name of justice. A daughter seeking vengeance for her father's death. And herself, caught between honor and survival. Colonel Blackthorn was feeding Confederate forces information about our movements, Kalen said, his voice steady despite the accusation hanging over him. 23 good men died in the ambush at Miller's Creek because she sold them out for Confederate gold. So you appointed yourself judge and executioner. Nightmore's tone was conversational, but his hand never left his sword hilt. I followed orders. General Blackmore himself confirmed her guilt, gave me the warrant. Kalen's jaw tightened. She died as a traitor deserved to die. Convenient that General Blackmore is no longer alive to confirm your story. Convenient that you're being paid by someone who values vengeance over justice. Muriel watched this deadly dance of words, understanding dawning like cold sunrise. Whose daughter was she? She asked quietly. Nightmore's smile was winter sharp. Lord Aldous Ravencrest. He spent considerable resources tracking his daughter's killer across 3 counties. The name hit her like a physical blow. Lord Ravencrest, one of the wealthiest landowners in the border regions, a man whose influence reached deep into Parliament itself. If he wanted Kalen dead, no amount of military heroism would save him. So this was never about justice, she said. It was about a father's grief and the weight of his purse. Justice is a luxury for those who can afford it, Miss Windrider. Nightmore gestured to his men, who began closing in. Lord Ravencrest can afford a great deal of justice. But as the border guards moved forward, Ezrin Clownmere, still bound, but no longer cowering, spoke up with surprising clarity. Soldiers came through 3 summers past, he said, his voice losing its usual confusion. Confederate soldiers. Said they had a friend in the Highland Regiment. Laughed about how easy it would be to kill Scottish boys when they knew exactly where to find them. Everyone turned to stare at the simple-minded vagrant. Except Muriel noticed he didn't look simple anymore. His eyes held intelligence, calculation, the look of a man who'd spent years letting others underestimate him. What are you saying? Nightmore's voice sharpened. I'm saying I was there when Colonel Blackthorn met with Confederate officers. Saw her hand over the patrol schedules myself. Ezrin struggled to his feet despite his bonds. Poor Ezrin, the simpleton sees everything, hears everything. Nobody pays attention to a mad beggar. Kalen's expression shifted from resignation to wonder. You witnessed the treason? Aye. And I saw what happened after. How she tried to flee when the general's men came for her. How she pulled a hidden pistol and nearly killed young Sergeant Viral before he put steel between her ribs. Ezrin's gaze fixed on Nightmore. Self-defense. It was not murder. The border guard captain's face darkened. The word of a vagrant means nothing in a court of law. Perhaps not, Muriel said, moving to her father's desk. but the word of a decorated intelligence officer might carry more weight. She withdrew another paper from the military chest, one she'd overlooked in her earlier search. An intelligence report, signed and sealed, detailing Confederate infiltration of Highland regiments. At the bottom, in precise script, Agent E. Cloudmere, Military Intelligence Division. "You're a spy," she breathed. Ezrin's mad grin returned, but now it looked less addled and more predatory. "Was a spy, lass. Still am, when needed." Lord Ravencrest's gold bought him border guards, but it couldn't buy him truth. Nightmore's composure cracked. His hand moved to his sword, but faster than thought. Kaelin stepped between him and Muriel, her father's cavalry saber somehow appearing in his grip. 6 against 2 are poor odds, Nightmore snarled. 6 against 3, Ezrin corrected, producing a wicked-looking knife from somewhere in his rags. "And one of us knows all your names, all your crimes, all the bribes you've taken from grieving fathers with deep pockets." The standoff stretched taut as wire. Through the window, Muriel could see storm clouds gathering again, another tempest, rolling across the moors like divine judgment. Then Kaelin did something unexpected. He lowered his sword. "Enough." His voice carried quiet authority. "Captain Nightmore, you have a choice. Right away now, report to Lord Ravencrest that his daughter's killer has vanished and lived to collect other bounties. Or try to take me here, in this house, and discover whether a war hero fights better or worse than a cornered deserter. You're outnumbered." But I'm fighting for something worth dying for." Kaelin's gaze found Muriel's. "And sometimes that makes all the difference." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Muriel felt something shift inside her chest, not just understanding, but recognition. This was what her father had meant about love mattering more than honor. Not the desperate passion of youth, but the steady flame that burned bright enough to die for. Nightmore must have seen it too, because his predatory confidence wavered. A man fighting for money was dangerous. A man fighting for love was unpredictable. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Yes, it is." Muriel's voice carried surprising steel. "Because I'm writing to General Harrison Blackmore tonight, informing him that border guards are operating outside their authority, hunting decorated war heroes on false charges." She gestured to the documents scattered across her table. "And I suspect the general takes a dim view of men who question his commendations." It was a bluff, but a good one. General Blackmore's reputation for protecting his soldiers was legendary. No border guard captain wanted to explain why he'd been hunting a man the general had personally decorated. Nightmore's pale eyes promised future retribution, but he stepped back. "Mount up," he called to his men. They filed out like beaten dogs, their bounty slipping through their fingers. Through the window, Muriel watched them ride away across the storm-darkened moor, their retreating figures swallowed by gathering clouds. When the hoofbeats faded, she turned to find Kaelin slumped against the wall, the sword fallen from nerveless fingers. The confrontation had cost him. Fever spots burned high on his cheeks, and fresh blood stained his bandages. "You fool," she said softly, moving to support him. "You should have stayed hidden. And let them take you?" "Never." His hand found hers, warm despite his fever. "Your father saved my life at Thornridge. Today I return the favor. By risking your own. By proving his daughter was worth saving." Ezrin cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should make myself scarce. Intelligence work and romance mix about as well as whiskey and gunpowder." "Stay," Muriel said. "Both of you. The storm's not finished, and neither are we." As if summoned by her words, rain began pattering against the windows. But this time, the sound held promise rather than menace. She helped Kaelin to the chair by the fireplace, then moved to kindle a fresh blaze against the gathering dusk. "What happens now?" Kaelin asked. "Now you heal. Properly this time, without border guards hunting you." She met his eyes across the firelight. "And then we see what two people can build from the wreckage of war. I'm a killer, Muriel. That won't change. You're a soldier who did his duty. My father would understand that." She touched the locket at her throat. Her mother's locket returned. At last, he'd also understand that some debts can only be repaid with love. Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, but within the cottage, warmth bloomed like roses after rain. 3 unlikely souls, thrown together by fate and held by choice, finding shelter not just from the weather, but from the ghosts that had haunted them in the months that followed. Kalen's wounds healed and his nightmares faded. Ezran disappeared, as mysteriously as he'd arrived, leaving only a note. Some secrets are worth keeping. Some loves are worth protecting. And Muriel discovered that the heart, like Highland heather, could bloom even in the harshest soil when tended with patience and faith. The cottage on the moor became a haven for travelers and lost souls. A place where honor was measured not in medals, but in kindness, where love mattered more than survival, and where the daughter of a war hero and the sergeant who'd carried his final words built something beautiful from the ashes of grief. Remember, dear listeners, that kindness costs nothing but creates miracles. If this tale warmed your heart, favor us with your thoughts below and tell us from what distant corner of the world you're listening today. Until our next story, may your hearth stay warm and your heart stay open.